the end of which is unlike the beginning. Part 1. Cosette's grief, so poignant still, and so acute 4 or 5 months before, had, without her knowledge even, entered upon convalescence. Nature, spring, her youth, her love for her father, the gaiety of the birds and the flowers, were filtering in little by little, day by day, drop by drop, into this soul so pure and so young, something which almost resembled oblivion. Was the fire dying out entirely, or was it merely becoming a bed of embers? The truth is that she had scarcely anything left of that sorrowful and consuming feeling. One day she suddenly thought of Marius. "What?" said she. "I do not even think of him now." This was the very time when Marius was descending gloomily towards agony, and saying, "If I could only see her again before I die." Whose fault was it? Nobody's. Marius was of that temperament which sinks into grief and remains there. Cosette was of that which plunges in and comes out again. A singular incident followed. In the garden, near the grated gate, on the street, there was a stone seat protected from the gaze of the curious by a hedge, but which, nevertheless, by an effort, the arm of a passer could reach through the grating and the hedge. One evening, in this same month of April, Jean Valjean had gone out. Cosette, after sunset, had sat down on this seat. The wind was freshening in the trees. Cosette was musing. A vague sadness was coming over her little by little, that invincible sadness which evening gives, and which comes perhaps, who knows, from the misery of the tomb, half opened at that hour. Fantine was perhaps in that shadow. Cosette rose, slowly made the round of the garden, walking in the grass which was wet with dew, and saying to herself, through the kind of melancholy somnambulism in which she was enveloped, "One really needs wooden shoes for the garden at this hour. I shall catch cold." She returned to the seat. Just as she was sitting down, she noticed in the place she had left a stone of considerable size, which evidently was not there the moment before. Cosette reflected upon this stone, asking herself what it meant. Suddenly the idea that this stone did not come upon the seat of itself, that somebody had put it there, that an arm had passed through that grating, this idea came to her and made her afraid. There was the stone. No doubt was possible. She did not touch it, fled without daring to look behind her, took refuge in the house, and immediately shut the glass door of the stairs with shutter, bar, and bolt. She asked Toussaint, "Has my father come in?" "Not yet, mademoiselle." Cosette had all the doors and windows carefully closed, made Toussaint go over the whole house from cellar to garret, shut herself up in her room, drew her bolts, looked under her bed, lay down, and slept badly. All night she saw the stone as big as a mountain, and full of caves. At sunrise, the peculiarity of sunrise is to make us laugh at all our terrors of the night, and our laugh is always proportioned to the fear we have had. At sunrise, Cosette on waking looked upon her fright as upon a nightmare, and said to herself, "What have I been dreaming about?" The sun, which shone through the cracks of her shutters, and made the damask curtains purple, reassured her to such an extent that it all vanished from her thoughts, even the stone. She dressed herself, went down to the garden, ran to the bench, and felt a cold sweat. The stone was there. But this was only for a moment. What is fright by night is curiosity by day. "Huh," said she. "Now, let us see." She raised the stone, which was pretty large. There was something underneath which resembled a letter. It was a white paper envelope. Cosette seized it. There was no address on the one side, no wafer on the other. Still, the envelope, although open, was not empty. Papers could be seen in it. Cosette examined it. There was no more fright. There was curiosity no more. There was a beginning of anxious interest. Cosette took out of the envelope what it contained, a quire of paper, each page of which was numbered and contained a few lines written in a rather pretty handwriting, thought Cosette, and very fine. Cosette looked for a name. There was none. A signature? There was none. To whom was it addressed? To her, probably, since a hand had placed the packet upon her seat. From whom did it come? An irresistible fascination took possession of her. She endeavored to turn her eyes away from these leaves which trembled in her hand. She looked at the sky, the street, the acacias, all steeped in light, some pigeons which were flying about a neighboring roof. Then, all at once, her eye eagerly sought the manuscript, and she said to herself that she must know what was there in it. This is what she read. Part 2. The reduction of the universe to a single being. The expansion of a single being even to God. This is love. God is behind all things, but all things hide God. Things are black, creatures are opaque. To love a being is to render her transparent. Love partakes of the soul itself. It is of the same nature. Like it, it is a divine spark. Like it, it is incorruptible, indivisible, imperishable. It is a point of fire which is within us, which is immortal and infinite, which nothing can limit, which nothing can extinguish. We feel it burn even in the marrow of our bones, and we see it radiate even to the depths of the sky. O love, adorations, light of two minds which comprehend each other, of two hearts which are interchanged, of two glances which interpenetrate. You will come to me, will you not, happiness? Walk us together in the solitudes, days blessed and radiant. I have sometimes dreamed that from time to time hours detached themselves from the life of the angels and came here below to pass through the destiny of men. God can add nothing to the happiness of those who love one another, but to give them unending duration. After a life of love, an eternity of love is an augmentation indeed, but to increase its intensity, the ineffable felicity which love gives to the soul in this world is impossible, even with God. God is the plenitude of heaven, love is the plenitude of man. You look at a star from two motives, because it is luminous and because it is impenetrable. You have at your side a softer radiance and a greater mystery, woman. If you are stone, be lodestone. If you are plant, be sensitive. If you are man, be love. Does she still come to the Luxembourg? No, monsieur. She hears mass in this church, does she not? She comes here no more. Does she still live in this house? She has moved away. Whither has she gone to live? She did not say. What a gloomy thing, not to know the address of one's soul. You who suffer because you love, love still more. To die of love is to live by it. What a grand thing to be loved. What a grander thing still to be loved. The heart becomes heroic through passion. It is no longer composed of anything but what is pure. It no longer rests upon anything but what is elevated and great. An unworthy thought can no more spring up in it than a nettle upon a glacier. The soul, lofty and serene, inaccessible to common passions, common emotions, rising above the clouds and the shadows of this world, its follies, its falsehoods, its hates, its vanities, its mini-series, it inhabits the blue of the skies, and only feels more the deep and subterranean commotions of destiny, as the summit of the mountains feels the quaking of the earth. Were there not somebody who loved, the sun would be extinguished. Part 3. During the reading, Cosette entered gradually into reverie. This manuscript, in which she found still more clearness and obscurity, had the effect upon her of half-opened sanctuary. Each of these mysterious lines were resplendent to her eyes, and flooded her heart with a strange light. The education which she had received had always spoken to her of the soul, and never of love. Almost like one who should speak of the brand and not of the flame. The manuscript revealed to her suddenly and sweetly the whole of love, the sorrow, the destiny, the life, the eternity, the beginning, the end. It was like a hand which had opened and thrown suddenly upon her a handful of sunbeams. She felt in these few lines a passionate, ardent, generous, honest nature, a consecrated will, an immense sorrow, and a boundless hope, an oppressed heart, a glad ecstasy. Now, these pages, from whom could they come? Who could have written them? Cosette did not hesitate for a moment. One single man. He. Day had revived in her mind. All had appeared again. She felt a wonderful joy and deep anguish. It was he who wrote to her, he who was there, he whose arm had passed through that grating. While she was forgetting him, he had found her again. But had she forgotten him? No, never. She was mad to have thought so for a moment. She had always loved him, always adored him. The fire had been covered and had smouldered for a time, but she clearly saw it had only sunk into the deeper, and now it burst out anew and fired her whole being. This letter was like a spark dropped from that other soul into hers. She felt the conflagration rekindling. She was penetrated by every word of the manuscript. "Oh, yes," said she. "How I recognize all this! This is what I had already read in his eyes." She went back to the house, and shut herself up in her room to read over the manuscript again, to learn it by heart and to muse. When she had read it well, she kissed it and put it in her bosom. It was done. Cosette had fallen back into the profound seraphic love. The abyss of Eden had reopened. All that day Cosette was in a sort of stupefaction. She could hardly think. Her ideas were like a tangled skein in her brain. She could really conjecture nothing. She hoped, while yet trembling. What? Vague things. She dared to promise herself nothing. She would refuse herself nothing. Pallors passed over her face and chills over her body. It seemed to her at moments that she was entering the chimerical. She said to herself, "Is it real?" Then she felt of the beloved paper under her dress. She pressed it against her heart. She felt its corners upon her flesh, and if Jean Valjean had seen her at that moment, he would have shuddered before that luminous and unknown joy which flashed from her eyes. "Oh, yes," thought she, "it is indeed he. This comes from him to me." And she said to herself that an intervention of angels, that a celestial chance had restored him to her. Part 4. When evening came, Jean Valjean went out. Cosette dressed herself. She arranged her hair in the manner which best became her, and she put on a dress, on the neck of which, as it received one cut of the scissors too much, and as, by this slope, it allowed the turn of the neck to be seen, was, as young girls say, a little immodest. It was not in the least in the world immodest, but it was prettier than otherwise. She did all this without knowing why. Did she intend to go out? No. Did she expect to visit? No. At dusk, she went down to the garden. Toussaint was busy in her kitchen, which looked out upon the backyard. She began to walk under the branches, pushing them aside with her hand from time to time, because there were some that were low. She thus reached the seat. The stone was still there. She sat down and laid her soft white hand upon that stone, as if she would caress it and thank it. All at once, she had that indefinable impression which we feel, though we see nothing, when there is somebody standing behind us. She turned her head and arose. It was he. He was bareheaded. He appeared pale and thin. She had hardly discerned his black dress. The twilight dimmed his fine forehead and covered his eyes with darkness. He had, under a veil of incomparable sweetness, something of death and of night. His face was lighted by the light of a dying day, and by the thought of a departing soul. It seemed as if he was not yet a phantom, and was now no longer a man. His hat was lying a few steps distant in the shrubbery. Cosette, ready to faint, did not utter a cry. She drew back slowly, for she felt herself attracted forward. He did not stir. Through the sad and ineffable something which enwrapped him, she felt the look of his eyes, which she did not see. Cosette, in retreating, encountered a tree and leaned against it. But for this tree she would have fallen. Then she heard his voice, that voice which she had never really heard, hardly rising above the rustling of the leaves, and murmuring, "Pardon me, I am here. My heart is bursting. I could not live as I was. I have come. Have you read what I placed there on this seat? Do you recognize me at all? Do not be afraid of me. It's a long time now. Do you remember the day when you looked upon me? It was at the Luxembourg near the Gladiator. And the day when you passed before me? It was the 16th of June and the 2nd of July. It will soon be a year. For a very long time now, I have not seen you at all. At night I come here. Do not be afraid. Nobody sees me. I come for a look near your windows. I walk very softly that you may not hear, for perhaps you would be afraid. Once I heard you sing, I was happy. Does it disturb you that I should hear you sing through the shutter? It can do you no harm. It cannot, can it? See, you are my angel. Let me come sometimes. I believe I am going to die, but if you but knew, I adore you. Pardon me, I am talking to you. I do not know what I am saying to you. Perhaps I annoy you. Do I annoy you? Oh, mother, said she, and she sank down upon herself as if she were dying. He caught her. She fell. He caught her in his arms. He grasped her tightly, unconscious of what he was doing. He supported her even while tottering himself. He felt as if his head was enveloped in smoke. Flashes of light passed through his eyelids. His ideas vanished. It seemed to him that he was performing a religious act, and that he was committing a profanation. Moreover, he did not feel one passionate emotion for this ravishing woman, whose form he felt against his heart, and was lost in love. She took his hand and laid it on her heart. He felt the paper there and stammered, You love me then? She answered in a voice so low that it was no more than a breath, which could hardly be heard. Hush, you know it. And she hid her blushing head in the bosom of the proud and intoxicated young man. He fell upon the seat, she by his side. There were no more words. The stars were beginning to shine. How was it that their lips met? How is it that the birds sing? that the snow melts, that the rose opens, that May blooms, that the dawn whitens behind the black trees on the shivering summit of the hills. One kiss, and that was all. Both trembled, and they looked at each other in the darkness with brilliant eyes. They felt neither the fresh night, nor the cold stone, nor the damp ground, nor the wet grass. They looked at each other, and their hearts were full of thought. They had clasped hands without knowing it. She did not ask him. She did not even think of it. In what way and by what means he had succeeded in penetrating into the garden. It seemed so natural to her that he should be there. From time to time, Marius' knee touched Cosette's knee, which gave them both a thrill. At intervals, Cosette faltered out a word. Her soul trembled upon her lips like a drop of dew upon a flower. Gradually, they began to talk. Overflow succeeded to silence, which is fullness. The night was serene and splendid above their heads. These two beings, purest spirits, told each other all their dreams, their frenzies, their ecstasies, their chimeras, their despondencies, how they had adored each other from afar, how they had longed for each other, their despair when they had ceased to see each other. They confided to each other in an intimacy of the ideal, which even now nothing could have increased. All that was most hidden and most mysterious of themselves, these two hearts poured themselves out into each other, so that at the end of an hour it was the young man who had the young girl's soul, and the young girl who had the soul of the young man. They interpenetrated, they enchanted, they dazzled each other. When they had finished, when they had told each other everything, she laid her head upon his shoulder and asked him, "What is your name?" "My name is Marius," said he. "And yours?" "My name is Cosette."